To all storytellers and story lovers, my name is Laksh Datta. I host and produce the Jaipur Bites podcast, where you can hear many of the amazing sessions from the Jaipur Literature Festival. I also produce a few other podcasts, as you can see right here. English, Hindi, fiction, non-fiction. If you see something you like, maybe you can take a screenshot of this right now. I'll give you a second. And tune in later. Find them on your favorite podcast app.
We're delighted to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, straight from the front lawns of Diggi Palace. It is our pleasure to present today Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. Alex Ross in conversation with Katherine Shawfield. Renowned author and music critic Alex Ross's latest book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, unravels the cultural history and significance of Richard Wagner and the kaleidoscopic work and life he inhabited. Ross weaves together not just Wagner's story, but also the political, artistic and cultural history of the last 150 years. Ross's other books include The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century and Listen to This. In conversation with academic and author Katherine Shawfield, Ross delves into the artistic genius of Wagner and the impact of art in world history. Alex Ross has been the music critic of The New Yorker since 1996. He is the author of The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century, Listen to This, and Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. He has received a Guggenheim Fellowship and a MacArthur Fellowship. Katherine Shawfield is a historian of Hindustani music and Mughal India. In telling stories about musical lives, she writes on sovereignty and selfhood, affection and desire, sympathy and loss and power, worldly and strange. Her latest book, Music and Musicians in Late Mughal India, Histories of the Ephemeral 1748 to 1858, will be out with Cambridge University Press in 2022. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section. We now present Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. Alex Ross in conversation with Katherine Shawfield. Over to you, Katherine.
Thank you. And it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to be here with Alex Ross talking about his new book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. It's particularly so as my own students are a big fan of his first book, The Rest is Noise, which is on all our reading lists at King's College London in the music department. And this new book is a monumental ride through an amazing period of the 19th and 20th centuries. Richard Wagner is the colossus of music for the 19th century, born in 1813, died in 1883. It can be quite easy to forget actually how early he is in the 19th century because his music is so modern and has had such a big impact on the 20th century in particular. He's, of course, the composer and librettist and all-round creator of operas, The Flying Dutchman, Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, Tristan and Isolde, The Ring Cycle, particularly his great work, Die Meistersinger, and his wonderful last opera, Parsifal, which is my favorite. But he's also famous and indeed notorious for his essays and his writing on music, art, religion, and politics, and particularly his notorious negative views of Jews in music. So Alex Ross's book doesn't just talk about this towering figure. It's really a book about Wagnerism, and I'm going to get him to explain what he means by that shortly, but really his impact in his lifetime, but particularly after his death. So Wagner's music, of course, hit like a bolt from the blue into Western art music, and it's had incredibly far-reaching consequences globally, particularly on cinema. The idea of the total artwork, the Gesamtkunstwerk that he developed, which is not unlike, in fact, the Sanskrit idea of Sangeet, music, dance, drama, all wrapped up together, but but also things like the leitmotif, the idea that you have this single musical cell that kind of runs throughout a large-scale work like a film, which has even had an influence on Hindi cinema. So those cinema fans who know Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, another favorite of mine, otherwise known as DDLJ, there's a famous fragment of melody that is played by Shah Rukh Khan on the mandolin, which is a foreshadowing of the great love song of that film, Darling, on Seeing You, I Knew That Love Is Crazy, which actually comes right at the end of the film, but it's foreshadowed all the way through by Shah Rukh Khan's mandolin playing. So, you know, this Wagnerian melodrama coming through in music for film, even in the Hindi cinema. But of course, his influence, Wagner's influence, is much wider than that in the 20th century, particularly on art, literature, new religious movements, as I hope we're going to talk about, and of course, politics. I'm going to note in passing that our most common associations with Wagner are, and his influence are, of course, with the philosopher Nietzsche and with Hitler and Nazism. But the really great thing about Alex's book is that it takes us on many roads less traveled in its exploration of Wagnerism. For example, Jewish Wagner. There were a number of Jews in Wagner's circle who defended him even after his publications. Black Wagner, feminist and gay Wagner. And I just want to quote a little bit from the end of Alex's book, where he talks about how complex Wagner is as a character. And he says, these tangled histories raise bigger and tougher questions. In the face of a sacred monster like Wagner, what power do spectators have? Are we necessarily subject to the domination of his works and complicit in their ideology? Or in embracing them, can we take possession of them and remake them in our own image? Actually, that's from slightly earlier in the book, apologies, but it's a really important question. And reading this book, it's so rich, and it's like living with Wagner and inside Wagner, but also inside those people who spun out from him and were inspired by him or inspired against him. So without any further noise from me, being the rest and the rest being noise, I want to turn over to you now, Alex, to begin and perhaps to read something, if you would like to, from your new book. Just tell us, remind us who Wagner was, why he was so important, and then hopefully I'd really like to know what you mean by the term Wagnerism.
Oh, thank you so much, Catherine. And I think you've done a far better job summing up my entire book in a brief space of time than I could have done myself. So that's saved me some trouble. But thank you so much for that lovely introduction. So yeah, I'll just begin with the very first paragraphs of the book, which I think really convey in a kernel, hopefully, who Wagner was and why his impact was so extraordinary. And this opening passage also conveys the frame of the book, which is really the aftermath of Wagner, what follows Wagner, not so much his life itself. Only down deep is it trusty and true, false and base is the revelry above. At the end of Das Rheingold, the first part of Richard Wagner's operatic cycle, The Ring of the Nibelung, the gods are entering the newly built palace of Valhalla, and the Rhine maidens are singing in dismay. The river nymphs know that Valhalla rests on a corrupt foundation, its laborers paid in gold extracted from the water's depths. On the evening of February 12th, 1883, some 3 decades after Rheingold was finished, and 7 years after the ring was first performed complete, Wagner played the Rhine Maiden's Lament on the piano. As he got into bed, he remarked, "I am fond of them, these subordinate beings of the deep, with their yearning." Wagner was 69 years old and in poor health. Since September 1882, he had been living with his family in a side wing of the Palazzo Vendramin Calergi, on the Grand Canal in Venice. Sequestered in what he called his blue grotto, a chamber decorated in multicolored satin fabrics and white lace, he was writing an article entitled "On the Womanly in the Human." When it was done, he had said, he would begin composing symphonies. The next day, clad in a pink dressing gown, Wagner continued to work on his essay. In a corner of a blank page, he wrote, "Nonetheless, the process of the emancipation of women goes ahead only amid ecstatic convulsions. Love, tragedy." Elsewhere in the family suite, Cosima Wagner, the composer's second wife, was playing Schubert's song Lob der Tränen, in praise of tears, at the piano, in an arrangement by her father, Franz Liszt. Sometime after 2, Wagner cried out, asking for Cosima and his doctor, Friedrich Kepler. He was found writhing in pain, a hand clutched to his heart. A maid and a valet carried him to a settee next to a window facing the Grand Canal. When the valet tried to remove the gown, something fell to the floor, and Wagner uttered his apparent last words, "My watch." At around 3 p.m., Dr. Kepler entered and established that the Meister, the sorcerer of Bayreuth, the creator of The Ring, Tristan and Isolde, and Parsifal, the man whom Friedrich Nietzsche described as a volcanic eruption of the total undivided artistic capacity of nature itself, whom Thomas Mann called probably the greatest talent in the entire history of art, was dead. So that's where the book begins, with Wagner's death. And I go on to describe the global ceremony of mourning that ensued as the news of Wagner's death went out across the world, and an enormous upwelling of whether it was praise or skepticism or condemnation or some mixture of all those qualities. The world registered Wagner's death in an extraordinary way. But then something else begins to happen. After Wagner's death, one might have assumed that he would sort of begin to fade back into history, that he would sort of become one of the great composers of the past. But instead, there was this eruption of interest, renewed interest in Wagner, not just in music, but all through the arts. And this is what I've called, and many other people have called, Wagnerism. The term came into being later in his life. This idea that Wagner was a movement, a tendency, a kind of path for other artists to follow, not just in music. And this was a sort of unprecedented phenomenon, that a musical figure would become a general artistic phenomenon. Nothing like this had happened before, and arguably nothing like it has happened since. And the height of it was in what we call the fin de siècle, the end of the century, the end of the 19th century, and the first years of the 20th century. And it seemed as though in this period there were very few major figures in the arts and literature and in intellectual life more broadly, politics as well, who didn't have some kind of opinion about Wagner, some kind of stance on Wagner. It just seemed as though you were required to sort of have a position on Wagner. And many major figures had a quite intense relationship with Wagner. And I talk about Thomas Mann, Marcel Proust, James Joyce, Willa Cather, Virginia Woolf, Vasily Kandinsky, many others. And so Wagner actually plays an important role in the emergence of what we call modernism in the arts. He was seen to be an avant-garde figure and prophetic of these extraordinary breakthroughs in the arts that took place right at the beginning of the 20th century. But at the same time, of course, he was increasingly associated with conservative tendencies in politics. So it's a very contradictory phenomenon, where in some ways it seems to sort of move forward and sort of expand outward. And in other ways, it seems to be kind of narrowing steadily narrowing in terms of its influence. And so the complexity of it is enormous. The scope of it is enormous. And this is a long book, and I try to account for as many of these phenomena as I can. And yet there's a great deal that I left out, and there's much more that could be said. And when you were just talking about leitmotifs in Bollywood, I immediately thought, oh, well, that should have been in there too. I wish I'd talked to you. And so it can go on and on and on. But this is an attempt to frame this whole question of what Wagner meant for that period of time, the years around 1900, and what he continues to mean in the present, because he remains a very controversial figure, a very unsettled figure, and he still is a figure from whom artists in other fields take inspiration. And so Wagnerism continues today in all different ways.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's really valuable that you've done here, is actually to point out the range of Wagnerisms, you know, up to the Nazi period, when so much of our post-45 memory of Wagnerism is so bound up with that horrific moment, and it's very interesting that it's at this point that we seem to be able to look back and recover some of these things, because of course Wagner in many ways was cancelled in common parlance by so many people, and so many of us still have to grapple with the terrible parts of his legacy. The term I think you use, sacred monster, is in so many ways a really valuable way of putting it, a really iconic way of putting it. And I think one of the things that you do so well is that you point out some of the reasons why his appeal was so wide and so complex. And one of those, I think, is the depth of the mythical world that he creates, which doesn't just draw us on Germanic and Norse mythology and so forth, but actually has a lot of deeper roots. And one of the really interesting things to me, and I think perhaps to the Jaipur audience, is the extent to which his ideas were underpinned by philosophers who'd been dealing a lot with Buddhist and Hindu mythology and philosophy. And I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more about those philosophers and how Buddhist and Hindu philosophy came into the mix. I just want to read another little telling quotation from you, which where you talk about the philosopher Ernst Bloch, and you say that he handily summarized Parsifal, his last opera, as Christian, Buddhist, Rosicrucian art religion, or religious art. Poised between blinding light, this is you now, poised between blinding light and devouring night, it rose as a supreme enigmatic symbol over the epoch of the fin de siècle, when artists everywhere felt that some revelation was at hand. And I think, you know, this is the appeal, that it has such deep and wide roots that it can be a revelation for all. So, yeah, we'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, of course, Wagner emerged from German Romanticism. He came along sort of at a somewhat later stage from the classic early phase of German Romanticism, but he inherited its legacy. And one remarkable thing about Goethe and Schiller and other German Romantics was their interest in non-Western thought and literature, and so Goethe's enthusiasm for Persian poetry, and also in German intellectual life, the discipline of so-called Orientalism really took root and became more and more widespread. And actually, Wagner's brother-in-law, the husband of one of his sisters, Hermann Brockhaus, was an important German Orientalist who translated Sanskrit and Persian. And so at a quite early stage, Wagner would have had exposure to these ideas just in family gatherings, but it would have happened anyway in terms of his exposure to German Romantic literature. And then there was Schopenhauer. And famously, Wagner suddenly electrifyingly discovered the philosophy of Schopenhauer in 1854 as he was working on the Ring Cycle. And it was an enormous revelation to him and sort of caused a general philosophical shift in his thought away from this early post-Hegelian, sort of post-revolutionary phase to something more in line with Schopenhauer's philosophy of resignation and renunciation, and that I think that particularly comes to the fore in Parsifal, which is a very Schopenhauerian opera. And of course, Schopenhauer was very acutely interested in the Indian traditions and East Asian traditions. Not necessarily with a sort of a very acute and exact understanding. It was all kind of filtered through a German sensibility, but nonetheless, it was very important to him, to Schopenhauer, and thus to Wagner. So all of that is kind of simmering in Wagner's work, and I think comes more and more to the fore and sort of reaches its climax in Parsifal. And Wagner sort of propagated this idea toward the end of his life that religion, sort of spirituality, could evolve in a way that it absorbed more and more of the different world traditions. This idea of a syncretic religion or sort of spiritual philosophy that would combine West and East and also sort of pagan elements. And that's what Parsifal is. I mean, Parsifal is, it's on the surface a sort of Christian tale, but it also has roots, especially in the Buddhist tradition and pagan elements as well. And so that's what he was striving for later in life, and he expounded on these ideas somewhat incoherently in his later essays. And that impulse in Wagner intersected very, very strongly with these new spiritual and religious ideas which spread in the last years of the 19th century, whether it was Rosicrucianism, these other kind of forms of occult pursuits, especially in France, or whether it was theosophy or anthroposophy and various other disciplines. And for all of those groups, you could always find Wagnerians, sort of in each of those groups. There were enthusiastic Wagnerians. And so it all kind of really wells up at the end of the 19th century in a fascinating way. And so this, especially the fourth chapter of my book, is very much focused on that question.
Yeah, I did actually want to ask you to kind of take us down that little route into this, to sort of the esoteric Wagnerism, because yes, you have these ideas coming through Schopenhauer of connections of Maya, the idea of illusion, and of nirvana, the kind of destruction of the self, which really does come across in something like an opera like Parsifal, and you can actually see the appeal of an opera like Parsifal, despite its ostensibly Christian framing, as you say, to esotericists and occultists and mystics of all kind, because of it's got all sorts of pagan and extra Christian and fantasy ritual and magic and miracles and so forth in it, and I just want to read a little bit from the beginning of the chapter, because of this chapter on the esoteric occult Satanist theosophist Wagner, because it's just such a brilliant dive into the underworld. I mean, you say it was the age of esotericism, occultism, Satanism, spiritism, theosophy, which of course has Indian roots, Swedenborgism, mesmerism, Martinism, and Kabbalism, reinventions or fabrications of medieval sects multiplied, the Knights Templar, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and various Rosicrucian orders, which sought to revive Renaissance alchemical and necromantic lore of obscure origin. Not only fringe gurus, but also denizens of high society were dabbling in seances, tarot cards, astrology, and homeopathy. A large number of writers, artists, and musicians took an interest in one or another of these movements. I'm just wondering whether you have a favorite theosophist or or esotericist amongst this cast of extraordinary characters who were Wagnerists.
Yeah, well, of course, it's a very diverse melange of people, and some of these characters were very serious and were figures who really built considerable movements. If you look at theosophy, if you look at Rudolf Steiner, and so I wouldn't want to sort of treat them in a kind of ironic or sort of amused way, but at the same time there are some other figures who are very eccentric, who are more than a little bit absurd, and as part of this European, and this is very much a European phenomenon at the end of the 19th century, at the end of a long period of peace and industrialization and sort of development of society and urbanization. There was this longing for some other path of life, outside of this sort of heavily urban existence, and so people were looking to the east. They were sort of looking to for alternative spiritualities to escape a world that had seemed to have become very, very artificial, very sort of unrooted. So I think that was sort of behind sort of all of these different phenomena. But I do have a couple of favorites, and I have to mention the extraordinary Parisian novelist, impresario, arts presenter, quasi philosopher, and self-described magus, Josephin Péladan, who wrote this sequence of 21 novels, not all of which, admittedly, I got around to reading, but I read a number of them. And they're extraordinary. They're absolutely wild and over the top and absurd. But there is also a kind of, it's another version of romanticism. It's this sort of reaching for the beyond. It's sort of reaching for the other, for extraordinary states of being, this sort of Faustian longing to break out into new spheres. And so that's what Péladan was expressing. And then he actually put together these art exhibitions under the umbrella of his Rosicrucian order in Paris in the 1890s, which exhibited some important symbolist artists, and so it wasn't all tomfoolery. But nonetheless, I did admittedly enjoy myself as I put together this section of the book, because you don't know what to what extent are you supposed to take it seriously. It was a kind of performance art, his magic rituals and his sort of pose as a magus, and so I enjoyed that very much. But I think coming back to the idea of combining the different traditions and sort of combining the sort of various sort of bodies of spiritual and religious thought, I think something that Wagner did, which was very important and perhaps is the most profound, enduring idea that he put forward, aside from the music itself, which was so extraordinary in his own terms, is his work with myth. And he sort of detached the idea of myth from mythology, from the sort of usual bodies of Greek mythology and Roman mythology, which was sort of studied in this antiquarian way. And he said, no, myth lives on. Myth is always modern, and it's always changing, and it's always evolving. And he looked over these various traditions, whether it's Western or Eastern, modern, ancient, and he saw the common patterns behind the mythic stories. And there were others who were thinking in this way, but Wagner was was a very significant figure in terms of what we think of as a comparative mythology. And later figures, very major authorities such as Claude Lévi-Strauss and also Carl Jung, hailed, recognized his perspicacity in detecting those common elements in the story. And that's what Parsifal is. He's finding a common pattern in several different mythic and religious stories, and then kind of layering them one on top of another. And this is a very considerable achievement on Wagner's part, and this is something that really lives on. If we look at our mythic stories of today, comic book stories and superhero stories, I mean, we see these same patterns playing out, and sometimes they're quite explicitly patterned after Wagner's own versions. Sometimes they more obliquely sort of echo his ideas, but above all, myth is modern. It lives on in sort of every form of sort of cultural expression, and its roots go very, very deep in human history, beyond history, sort of into the unrecoverable past.
Yeah, and incredibly deep and important to society today, which is one of his most brilliant insights. Stepping sideways, another one of the extraordinary things about Wagner, and another deep thing that was picked up in this case in American Wagnerism, was the importance of landscape. And one of the most surprising and interesting chapters in the book is the chapter on Willa Cather, who, of course, is one of the great American writers of place, but also of music and particularly opera. I just found this fascinating, and I'm just wondering whether you would like to talk a little bit about her and her relationship with landscape and Wagner's landscape.
Yeah, well, this is one of my favorite sections of the book, and it was actually a voyage of discovery for me. At the beginning of this process, which is more than a decade ago, I knew I'd read some of Cather's work, but I wouldn't have said that she was really kind of central to my kind of private literary canon. But I knew she was going to be a part of this book because she had written an entire novel, The Song of the Lark, about a Wagnerian soprano, and she wrote several other stories in which Wagner is very much front and center, including the early extraordinary story of Wagner Matinee. But as I worked on the book, I just found myself more and more absorbed in Cather's world. And I went to Nebraska, to this town where she spent much of her youth, Red Cloud. I went back 2 more times and did some work in the Cather archives in Lincoln, Nebraska, and really fell in love with the place. And met a number. For
those of us who've never been to Nebraska.
Yeah, well, it's flat, of course. Well, that's your first impression of it, that it's flat. The great wide open American prairie going on and on and on, and the big sky. But actually this area, Red Cloud, it's actually quite hilly. There's sort of hills and gorges, and so it undulates. It's a landscape that undulates and sort of has its dramatic perspectives. But sort of the basic sense of it is this huge sky, and we're sort of standing there in the middle of a field. You have this sense of sort of solitude amid grandeur, and this was something that Cather felt as a girl, sort of roaming these prairies, and it's something I think she immediately identified in Wagner as a sort of the sensation in Wagner of being out alone in this huge landscape. And I think this happens for a very specific musical reason, because Wagner famously in his operas abandons the usual forms. Here is overture, here's a chorus, a duet, an aria, another chorus, and so on and so forth. These very kind of crisp demarcations between kind of musical sections. Wagner sort of blows all that up, really, especially with the Ring cycle, but it's already happening in Tannhäuser and Lohengrin, the earlier operas. And instead we sort of enter into this continuous stream of sensation, and everything is always sort of blending into the next thing, always evolving, perpetual transition. Nothing is ever fixed. Tristan and Isolde, this opera that begins with a question mark, and it's sort of, it isn't resolved really until the very end, harmonically and also kind of in terms of the story. And so one way of thinking of that sort of continuous stream is as a kind of inward sensation, as a stream of consciousness. And that's what the French avant-gardists seized on in Wagner, Baudelaire and Mallarmé and Proust and outside of France, Joyce and Virginia Woolf as well, this kind of inner continuity. But I think for Cather, it was the outer continuity of the sort of the infinite landscape. And that is what she loved so much in Wagner. And so she repeatedly in her works uses Wagnerian analogies against her native landscapes. And then she posits these figures, usually women, not male heroes, but female heroic figures, solitary, independent, striving against that infinite Wagnerian landscape. And that is really the iconic Cather image from O Pioneers and My Antonia, is the woman, the self-sufficient woman in the landscape, which was a sort of important kind of proto-feminist contribution that Cather made to literature. She didn't write about women as dependent on a male context. She didn't write stories of marriage, you know, and sort of marital happiness or unhappiness. Sort of her women were able to exist outside of those frameworks, and so Wagner was part of that equation for Cather. But this was such a great reward of this book, is just to sort of go much deeper into Cather's world and to have this relationship now with the town and people there. And of course, I hadn't originally planned to have an entire chapter about Cather in my book, but that is what happened. And she is actually the only figure in the book who has a chapter unto herself.
Yeah, and as she should. I mean, you know, this idea of the pioneer woman. I'm originally from Australia, and you think about all those women whose men would go off for months droving cattle, and they would be in charge of the homestead in a very, very dry environment. In some places in Australia, of course, very flat as well, with big skies and so on. And these women were extraordinary. Really extraordinary, and it really is this kind of, it's a different kind of modernism, and it's a different kind of world on the edge of becoming modern, which is just so fascinating in her writing, which you quote quite lavishly in the book, which is just wonderful. I've never read her, and I'm now going to, because it's really such an inspiring chapter. Thinking about this stream of American Wagnerism, which is different from the esoteric Wagnerism of fantasy Europe, and I'm just wondering what you would say Wagnerism is today. Is there a Wagnerism today? And if so, what shapes does it take in your experience?
Well, the phenomenon underwent several very important changes in the 20th century, and really it went into steep decline in the 20th century, and it was really the two wars that forever changed, the two world wars that forever changed Wagner's image and made him a much less universal figure in his appeal. In the First World War, Wagner came to be identified very strongly with German nationalism, and he was sort of weaponized during the war by German intellectual figures as well as military figures as a sort of symbol of German might. And so there was a backlash to that, somewhat understandably, in other Western European nations and in America, sort of among the enemy combatants in World War I. Wagner was actually banned, more or less banned, in America 1917, 1918, after America entered the war. And so sort of the golden age of Wagnerism was, I think, over at that point. Wagner had been nationalized. And this kind of seems remarkable in retrospect because we're so used to thinking of Wagner as this hyper-national figure. But he really wasn't. At the turn of the century, it was a very cosmopolitan profile that he had. And really other countries really felt that Wagner was theirs. I mean, in the sort of French Wagnerian tradition, he was really felt to be sort of more French than German in some ways, and sort of British and Americans and Spanish and Catalan Wagnerians, Italian Wagnerians, sort of everyone felt that they had, a piece of Wagner, and I think justly so, because Wagner did travel all over, and he did sort of gather influences from all different national traditions, and so people were justified in sort of finding themselves in Wagner. But that changed after the First World War, and then the Second World War. I mean, even more importantly, the legacy of Nazi Germany and Hitler's deep early identification with Wagner meant that sort of after 1945. Wagner was equated not only with the German nation, but with this extreme right-wing tendency in German history. And so, Wagnerism today is so heavily conditioned by that. And if we just bring up Wagner, to sort of the average person, I find that sort of the first reaction is, oh, well, Hitler's favorite composer. I mean, this is kind of the one thing that a lot of people know about Wagner, and so that is how Wagner is defined today. But there are many other strands to it, and sort of these older Wagnerisms kind of continue in a lot of different ways. And I think in film, in fantasy culture, and also in sort of in literary, more conventional literary fields, novels and poetry and painting, you find Wagner references in the paintings of Anselm Kiefer, in the novels of Philip K. Dick and other science fiction writers, and so it goes on. But the thing that must be contended with now is the association with Hitler, which of course is something I spend a lot of time on in the book, attempting to grapple with it and put it in the right context.
Yeah, I think you do have to. Well, we are drawing to the end of our time here, which is such a shame. I could talk to you about this forever, I think. But if just one very last quick question. Having come to the end of this very long journey through all this complexity, what is the one thing that you would take away from what you've learned with this? What, in the end, does Wagner's legacy have to tell us today about the relationship between music and aesthetics on the one hand and power on the other?
I think what Wagner teaches us is the power and the danger of our tendency to worship art, to make a religion of art. And at the turn of the century, Wagner was a kind of god in the cultural arena, and people did sort of see him as a vessel through which these sort of otherworldly and sort of spiritual forces flowed. And I think this is a natural tendency that we have as humans to sort of use our art as this religious iconography. And it's a sort of open question, which came first, sort of the tendency to make images, or sort of the sort of ideas of gods and of sort of higher presences in our life. And so it's a natural tendency. But we see in Wagner's case how it becomes enmeshed in real and dark historical and political forces in a way that is not unique the German case. And so this is something I stress very, very strongly at the end of the book. We cannot take away from this whole episode sort of simply the idea that something went terribly wrong in Germany, in German history and culture. This is a pattern that keeps recurring. And I certainly look to the American experience and to sort of ways in which American culture has been wrapped up in the Americans striving after power and how it has been used and misused. And I think sort of every national tradition can learn lessons from this tremendous and in many ways horrifying episode of Wagner in Germany. And at the same time, we can learn from the episode how to grapple with the past in a way that we don't sort of simply dispense with and kind of disregard what troubles us, because that's not the way to really kind of fundamentally confront these issues. We need to have an active relationship with a complex and troubling figure like Wagner. We need to sort of continue working through it. I mean, for one reason, to sort of hold on to what is so valuable and what is so beautiful and powerful in his work, but also to understand how sort of everything that we love and everything that we cherish has a dark history behind it, and Walter Benjamin's great comment, there's no document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. Wagner is a great illustration of that, but there is an infinite train of other examples in cultural history, and it's something we must always be aware of.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alex Ross. It's been a pleasure talking with you about your book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music.
Thank you so much, Katherine. It's been delightful to talk to you.
Thank you, Alice and Katherine, for such an outstanding conversation. It was superbly enjoyable. Thank you to our partners, Diageo, for their support, and thank you to all of you for being such a lovely audience. Please do stay logged on to continue to watch with us a series of exciting sessions we have specially curated for you. Also remember to buy your copy of the book from the Amazon online bookstore. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we did struggle to ensure that we can continue to bring to you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We'd love for you to support us at Teamwork Arts. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 and tag us at Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you in our other sessions.
To all storytellers and story lovers, my name is Laksh Datta. I host and produce the Jaipur Bites podcast, where you can hear many of the amazing sessions from the Jaipur Literature Festival. I also produce a few other podcasts, as you can see right here. English, Hindi, fiction, non-fiction. If you see something you like, maybe you can take a screenshot of this right now. I'll give you a second. And tune in later. Find them on your favorite podcast app.